On December 20th, 1943, at 27,000 feet above Nazi Germany, something impossible happened. A German fighter pilot looked into the eyes of his enemy and chose mercy over victory. What followed defied every rule of war and would haunt two men for the next 5 decades. Flight Lieutenant Charlie Brown gripped the controls of his B-17 Flying Fortress, blood streaming down his face from shrapnel wounds. Half his crew was injured, his tail gunner was dead, and his bomber looked like it had been chewed up and spit out by the gates of hell itself. The massive aircraft, which the crew had nicknamed Ye Old Pub, was barely holding together at 27,000 feet. But here's what nobody could have predicted. Below him, a German Messerschmitt Bf 109 was climbing to intercept, and the pilot inside was about to make a decision that would change both their lives forever. The mission had started like hundreds of others. Brown, just 21 years old and on his first combat mission as a pilot, was leading his crew on a bombing run to Bremen, Germany. The target was a Focke-Wulf aircraft factory, critical to the Nazi war machine. At 800 hours, 29 B-17 Flying Fortresses took off from Kimballton Airfield in England, their bellies loaded with 500-pound bombs and their crews loaded with nervous energy. Brown had trained for this moment for months, but nothing could prepare him for what was coming. The formation flew at 27,000 feet, where the temperature dropped to -60 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew wore heavy flight suits, but the cold still bit through every layer. Ice formed on the inside of the aircraft windows, and the gunners had to constantly flex their fingers to maintain feeling. The oxygen was so thin that without their masks they would have passed out in minutes. These details matter because at this altitude, every decision becomes a matter of life and death, and every mechanical failure becomes exponentially more dangerous. As they approached Bremen, German fighters swarmed the formation like angry wasps. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf 109s tore through the American bombers with machine guns blazing, the sky filled with tracers, explosions, and falling aircraft. Brown watched in horror as bombers around him burst into flames or simply broke apart, their crews tumbling through the freezing air. But his focus had to remain on the target. At precisely 14:30 hours, they released their bombs over the Focke-Wulf factory and began their turn for home. That's when everything went wrong. A Focke-Wulf 190 came screaming out of the sun, directly at Ye Olde Pub. Brown saw the muzzle flashes from its cannons and felt the aircraft shudder as 20mm shells tore through the fuselage. The first burst knocked out his No. 2 engine, which immediately caught fire. The second burst shattered the plexiglass nose cone, sending deadly shrapnel flying through the cockpit. Blood splattered across Brown's flight suit as metal fragments cut into his face and hands. The intercom crackled with urgent voices. "Pilot from tail gunner, we've been hit bad back here." But then silence. Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, their tail gunner, had been killed instantly when a cannon shell exploded in his position. The hydraulic system was destroyed, meaning no landing gear, no flaps, and minimal control surfaces. The electrical system was failing, and they were losing fuel fast from punctured tanks. But the German fighters weren't finished. Another FW-190 made a head-on attack, its guns concentrated on the cockpit. Brown dove the heavy bomber, trying to avoid the deadly stream of bullets, but several rounds found their mark. Co-pilot Spencer Luke slumped forward, unconscious from a head wound. Navigator Pinky Coulombe was hit in the leg. Radio operator Alex Yelasanko was wounded but still conscious. In the back of the aircraft, several gunners were injured and unable to defend themselves. Here's where it gets incredible. Brown realized they couldn't keep up with the formation. The No. 2 engine was windmilling, creating massive drag, and they were losing altitude rapidly. Worse yet, they had fallen behind the protective cover of the other bombers. They were alone, wounded, and flying a crippled aircraft over the heart of Nazi Germany. Any German pilot who spotted them would have an easy kill, and that's exactly what happened. Oberleutnant Franz Stiegler was returning to his base at Oldenburg after a successful morning mission. The 27-year-old German ace had already shot down 2 American bombers that day, bringing his total to 22 kills. Just 5 more victories would earn him the Knight's Cross, Nazi Germany's highest honor for bravery. His Messerschmitt Bf-109 G6 was low on fuel but still armed with cannon shells. When he spotted the lone, damaged B-17 limping toward the coast, he saw an easy opportunity to score his 23rd kill. Stigler climbed toward the crippled bomber, his finger moving to the trigger of his 30mm cannon. At 800 yards, he had a perfect shot. The B-17 was flying straight and level, unable to maneuver. Its gun positions were silent. This should have been over in seconds. But as Stigler closed to 400 yards, something made him hesitate. Through the massive holes in the bomber's fuselage, he could see the crew inside. Some were clearly wounded. He could see the blood on the walls of the aircraft. What happened next defies military logic. Stigler eased off his attack and flew alongside the crippled B-17, close enough to see Charlie Brown's face in the cockpit window. The German pilot found himself looking directly into the eyes of his enemy, and what he saw there changed everything. Brown was young, probably younger than Stigler himself. His face was covered in blood, and his eyes showed the pure terror of a man who knew he was about to die. In that moment, Franz Stigler remembered something his commanding officer had told him years earlier. "You are fighter pilots first, last, always. If I ever hear of any of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself." The words of Gustav Rödel echoed in Stigler's mind. This damaged bomber limping home with its wounded crew was no different from a parachute. They were defenseless. Instead of attacking, Stigler did something unprecedented in aerial combat. He began flying formation with the enemy aircraft, positioning his Messerschmitt on the bomber's wing. His presence served as protection. Any German anti-aircraft gunners who saw the formation would assume the B-17 was a captured prize being escorted to an airfield. German fighters would be less likely to attack if they saw one of their own already claiming the bomber. For 27 minutes, Franz Stigler escorted his enemy toward safety. He flew so close that Brown could see the German pilot's face clearly. Stigler even gestured toward Sweden, suggesting that Brown fly to neutral territory rather than attempt the dangerous journey across the North Sea to England. But Brown, either not understanding the gesture or determined to get his crew home, continued flying toward England. As they approached the coast, Stigler knew he had to turn back. German radar stations would be tracking them, and if he flew much further, he would be shot down by his own side. Before breaking away, he made eye contact with Brown one final time and saluted. Then he peeled off and disappeared into the gray December sky, leaving the crippled B-17 to continue its journey alone. The flight back to England was a nightmare of endurance. With one engine dead and massive damage throughout the aircraft, Ye Olde Pub was barely controllable. Brown had to use every ounce of his strength to keep the bomber in the air. The crew worked frantically to treat their wounded and prepare for an emergency landing. They threw everything they could out of the aircraft to reduce weight, including their machine guns and ammunition. As they crossed the English Channel, the weather deteriorated. Thick clouds obscured their vision, and they were running dangerously low on fuel. Brown couldn't contact any airfields because their radio was damaged. They were flying blind, hoping to spot any runway where they could attempt a crash landing. With no hydraulics, they couldn't lower their landing gear normally. With no electrical power, their instruments were failing one by one. Finally, through a gap in the clouds, Brown spotted the runway at Seething Airfield. It was an emergency landing strip, shorter than ideal for a B-17, but it was their only hope. Brown lined up for approach, knowing this would be the most difficult landing of his life. Without flaps or proper landing gear, they were coming in too fast and too steep. The bomber hit the runway hard, bounced twice, and skidded to a stop just yards from the end of the strip. When the ground crew reached Ye Olde Pub, they couldn't believe what they saw. The aircraft had over 400 bullet and shrapnel holes. The tail section was barely attached. The nose was completely destroyed. Several control cables were hanging by threads. One mechanic later said it looked like the bomber had been through a meat grinder. The fact that it had flown at all was miraculous. The fact that it had flown for 3 hours back to England was impossible. But Charlie Brown was haunted by what had happened over Germany. He couldn't stop thinking about the German pilot who had spared their lives. In his debrief with intelligence officers, Brown mentioned the incident, but he was advised not to discuss it further. The story didn't fit the narrative of total war that both sides were promoting. Mercy and compassion between enemies was not something either government wanted to publicize. Meanwhile, Franz Stiegler returned to his base and never mentioned the incident to his commanding officers. In Nazi Germany, showing mercy to the enemy was considered treason. If his actions had been discovered, he could have been court-martialed and shot. Stiegler continued flying combat missions until the end of the war, eventually earning the Knight's Cross he had been pursuing. But he never forgot the young American pilot whose life he had chosen to spare. After the war, both men tried to rebuild their lives. Brown returned to the United States, married his sweetheart, and started a career in the State Department. But he was never able to forget what happened on December 20th, 1943. The image of the German pilot flying beside him haunted his dreams. He wondered if the man had survived the war. He wondered why someone would risk everything to save his enemies. Stiegler, meanwhile, immigrated to Canada in 1953, seeking a fresh start away from war-torn Germany. He became a successful businessman, but he too carried the memory of that December day. Sometimes he would wonder what happened to the crew of the B-17 he had protected. Did they make it home safely? Did they survive the war? He had no way of knowing. For decades, both men lived with their secret. Brown occasionally told the story to close friends, but most people found it hard to believe. The idea that a German pilot would risk his life to protect American bombers seemed like something from a movie, not reality. Stiegler never mentioned the incident to anyone, fearing that even in peacetime, admitting to sparing enemy lives might be seen as betrayal by fellow veterans. But Charlie Brown couldn't let it go. In the 1980s, he began seriously searching for the German pilot who had saved his life. He contacted veteran organizations, aviation historians, and former Luftwaffe pilots. He placed advertisements in aviation magazines. He attended air shows and military reunions, telling his story to anyone who would listen. Most people were skeptical, but a few encouraged him to keep searching. The breakthrough came in 1989. Brown had placed an advertisement in a newsletter for German fighter pilots. It read, "To the Luftwaffe pilot who on 20 Dieck 1943 spared the lives of 10 Americans on a B-17 called Ye Old Pub. Please contact Charlie Brown." The advertisement was brief, but it contained enough specific details that only one person could respond. Franz Stiegler was living in Surrey, British Columbia when he saw the advertisement. For 46 years, he had kept the secret of what happened over Germany. Now, suddenly, he had the chance to finally learn what became of the crew he had protected. His hands trembled as he wrote his response letter. When Brown received Stiegler's letter, he could barely believe it. The German pilot provided details that only someone who was there could know. He described the damage to the B-17, the injuries to the crew, and even the gesture he had made toward Sweden. Most importantly, he explained why he had spared them. "I didn't have the heart to finish off those brave men," Stiegler wrote. "I saw them as human beings, not just enemies." The two men arranged to meet in person. On January 20th, 1990, Charlie Brown and Franz Stiegler came face-to-face for the first time since that December day over Germany 47 years earlier. The meeting took place at a hotel in Seattle, with both men bringing their wives. When they first saw each other, both veterans began crying. Brown later said it was like meeting a brother he had never known he had. Over the next few hours, they pieced together exactly what had happened on that fateful mission. Stiegler explained his thought process during those crucial minutes over Germany. Brown described the terror and confusion his crew had felt when they saw the German fighter alongside them. They compared their memories of the incident, finding remarkable consistency in their recollections, despite the passage of nearly 5 decades. But here's the most incredible part of the story. Both men realized that December 20th, 1943, had been the defining moment of their lives. Brown had gone on to serve with distinction for the remainder of the war, but he never forgot the lesson about humanity that the German pilot had taught him. Stiegler continued to serve in the Luftwaffe until Germany's surrender, but he never again had the opportunity to show such mercy. and he never forgot the American crew, whose lives he had chosen to preserve. The reunion led to a deep friendship between the two former enemies. They discovered they had much in common beyond their shared experience over Germany. Both were family men who had worked hard to build successful lives after the war. Both had struggled with the moral complexities of combat. Both had wondered for decades about what had happened to the other. They began meeting regularly, traveling together to air shows and veterans events. Stigler would often joke that he had finally gotten his 23rd kill since he had shot down Brown's anonymity by revealing himself after all those years. Brown would respond that Stigler had actually saved 10 lives that day, not just spared one aircraft. Their friendship became a symbol of reconciliation between former enemies. Their story eventually became known to a wider audience when they cooperated with author Adam Makos on a book called A Higher Call. The book here detailed not just the incident over Germany, but the decades-long search that brought them back together. It became a bestseller and introduced their story to a new generation who had never heard this remarkable tale of mercy in the midst of war's brutality. Franz Stigler passed away in 2008 at the age of 92. Charlie Brown died in 2008 as well, just months later. Their families said that both men felt complete knowing they had found each other again. The secret they had carried for so long had become a bridge between former enemies, proving that even in humanity's darkest hours, individual acts of compassion can transcend the hatred and violence of war. Today, their story serves as a reminder that behind every uniform, every aircraft, and every act of war are human beings making individual moral choices. Franz Stigler had been trained to kill enemy airmen. Charlie Brown had been ordered to destroy German cities, but in one crucial moment, humanity trumped military duty, and mercy overcame the machinery of war. The lesson extends far beyond World War II aviation history. In our current age of global conflict and political division, the story of these two men demonstrates that enemies can become friends, that understanding can replace hatred, and that sometimes the most courageous act is choosing not to fight. The German pilot who spared his enemies and the American pilot who spent 50 years searching for him remind us that individual acts of decency can change lives across decades and continents. Their story also highlights the psychological cost of war on all participants. Both Brown and Stigler carried the weight of their combat experiences for the rest of their lives. Brown was haunted by the loss of his tail gunner and the injuries to his crew. Stigler struggled with the knowledge that his 22 confirmed victories meant 22 enemy airmen had died by his hand. But their eventual reunion provided a form of healing that neither man had expected to find. The technical aspects of their encounter also deserve recognition. Flying formation with an enemy aircraft required extraordinary skill and judgment. Stigler had to position his fighter close enough to provide protection without causing a mid-air collision. He had to maintain formation speed with a heavily damaged bomber while managing his own fuel consumption. Most importantly, he had to make split-second decisions that could have cost him his life if German ground forces had misinterpreted his intentions. For Brown, nursing the crippled B-17 back to England was a feat of piloting that deserves to be remembered alongside any other act of aerial heroism. With one engine dead, no hydraulics, minimal electrical power, and a crew of wounded men depending on him, he managed to fly for 3 hours through enemy territory and hostile weather to bring them home safely. The fact that Yo Old Pub was able to fly at all after sustaining such damage speaks to both the ruggedness of the B-17 design and the skill of its pilot. Their story has inspired numerous documentaries, articles, and presentations at military academies around the world. It has become a case study in military ethics, demonstrating how individual conscience can operate even within the structure of military command. War colleges use their example to discuss the moral complexities that soldiers face in combat situations, where split-second decisions can mean the difference between life and death, between following orders and following one's conscience. The search itself became legendary among aviation enthusiasts. Brown's determination to find the German pilot who had saved his life demonstrated a persistence that bordered on obsession. For 46 years, he never gave up hope that somewhere in the world, the mystery pilot was still alive. His story inspired other veterans to search for former enemies who had shown them unexpected kindness during the war. What makes their reunion even more remarkable is the timing. Both men were in their 70s when they finally met again. They had lived full lives, raised families, and built successful careers, all while carrying the memory of those few minutes over Germany. Their friendship in their final years proved that it's never too late for understanding, never too late for forgiveness, and never too late to close the emotional wounds that war creates. The impact of their story continues to resonate today. In an era when veterans of World War II are passing away at a rate of hundreds per day, their tale preserves not just historical facts, but the human dimension of warfare. It reminds us that behind every statistic, every casualty report, and every mission summary were real people making real choices that affected real lives in ways that lasted decades. Perhaps most importantly, their story demonstrates that individual acts of humanity can survive and transcend even the most systematic attempts to dehumanize warfare. The Nazi regime had spent years indoctrinating German pilots to see Allied airmen as subhuman enemies deserving only death. American propaganda had similarly demonized German pilots as ruthless killers without conscience. Yet in one crucial moment, two young men saw past the uniforms and ideologies to recognize each other's essential humanity. That recognition changed both their lives and ultimately brought them together across the decades that followed, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon against hatred is simply the courage to see one's enemy as a fellow human being, worthy of mercy.